Okay, stop. Before you scroll past this, I need you to hear me out for a second. This is not another girl boss history video. This is not a list of 5 famous queens you already know about. This is something different. This is about the women history forgot to name. Because here's the thing. When we talk about ancient civilizations, we talk about kings, generals, philosophers, pharaohs, men who built empires, wrote laws, fought wars. But for every single one of those men, there was a mother, a wife, a daughter, a servant, a healer, a farmer, running half the machinery of that civilization and somehow getting almost none of the credit. And that's a problem. And today, we're fixing it. We're going back. Ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, China, and the Americas. We're going to find out what daily life actually looked like for ordinary women, what power they secretly held, and some of the absolutely wild things ancient men believed about them that will make you question everything you thought you knew. This is the video nobody made until now. Let's go. The women nobody wrote down. First, let's get something straight. Ancient women were not sitting around waiting to be rescued, married off, or written about. Shocker, I know. But you'd be surprised how much of what we know about ancient women comes from men describing them from the outside, laws restricting them, or myths about them, rather than their own voices. And that gap, that silence, it shaped how we understand entire civilizations for thousands of years. So before we get into the real, lived details, the jobs, the rights, the rebellions, we need to understand something. In almost every ancient society, women were essential to the economy and the household, and yet almost invisible in the official record. No pressure, ladies. Ancient Egypt, the outlier again. Let's start in Egypt, because Egypt, as usual, is doing the most while everyone else is figuring things out. Egyptian women had something genuinely rare in the ancient world: legal equality with men. They could own property. They could initiate divorce. They could run businesses, sign contracts, and testify in court, all without a male guardian's permission. That's not a modern reading of ancient sources. That's documented in actual Egyptian legal texts. Some women even became pharaohs in their own right, not as a figurehead, but as the actual ruler. Hatshepsut didn't just sit on the throne, she commissioned expeditions, built temples, and had herself depicted with the traditional pharaoh's false beard, because power needed to look a certain way, and she wasn't about to let biology get in the way of that. Compare that to what comes next, and you'll understand why Egypt is genuinely the outlier of this story. Mesopotamia. Brilliant, brutal, and complicated.
Atmospheric Mesopotamia, birthplace of writing, law, and also some of the strictest legal codes ever put on stone. Gloomy. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest written legal systems, laid out extremely specific rules for women, marriage, and property, and a lot of them were harsh by any standard. Discovery. But here's the twist. Some Mesopotamian women weren't just following those laws, they were writing literature under them. Enheduanna, a priestess in ancient Sumer around 2300 BCE, is the first author in human history whose name we actually know. Emphasis, serious. Not the first female author, the first author, full stop. Inspirational before Homer, before anyone. She wrote hymns and poetry that survive to this day. Descriptive. And in the markets and temples of Babylon and Ur, women worked as brewers, weavers, scribes, and moneylenders. Sarcastic beer, believe it or not, was largely a women's industry, brewed and sold by women for centuries. Ancient Greece, democracy for some, history. Ancient Greece, birthplace of democracy, philosophy, sarcastic, and also some of the most restrictive ideas about women ever put into a legal system. Serious. In Athens, the supposed cradle of democracy, citizen women couldn't vote, couldn't own significant property, and were expected to stay largely confined to the home. Discussed Aristotle, that guy again, wrote that women were deformed males, biologically incomplete versions of men. Anger. This wasn't a fringe opinion. This was mainstream philosophy for centuries. Tension. But Sparta, just a few hundred kilometers away, was a completely different story. Discovery. Spartan women owned land, roughly 2/5 of all Spartan territory by some estimates, trained physically alongside expectations of strength and fitness, and spoke their minds in ways that scandalized visiting Athenians. Narrative one Spartan woman, when an Athenian remarked that Spartan women were the only ones who ruled their men, Sarcastic reportedly replied that they were the only ones who gave birth to real men. Two city-states, one sea apart, two completely different universes for women. Rome, property power, and plenty again. Gravity Rome, the civilization that gave us law, concrete, unease, and also a legal category where women were technically the property of their fathers or husbands for most of their lives. Confusion. And yet, practically speaking, wealthy Roman women often wielded enormous influence behind the scenes, managing estates, running businesses, financing political campaigns. Suspense. Some, like Agrippina the Younger, didn't even bother staying behind the scenes. Alarmed, she openly maneuvered her son onto the imperial throne. Descriptive, ordinary Roman women worked as midwives, weavers, shopkeepers, and moneylenders. Sarcastic, keeping the actual economy of Rome running while the history books focused on senators giving speeches. China, the hidden hand behind the throne. Atmospheric. Traditional Chinese society operated on strict Confucian ideals. Obedience to father, then husband, then son. Quiet on paper, women had almost no independent authority. Shock. In practice, some of them ran empires. Authority. Empress Wu Zetian didn't just influence the Tang court from behind a curtain. Action she eventually declared herself emperor outright, the only woman in Chinese history to hold that title directly. Information. Beyond the palace, women in silk-producing regions controlled an entire economic sector, sericulture, the raising of silkworms, and weaving of silk. Sophisticated was overwhelmingly women's work, and it was one of the most valuable industries in the ancient world. The Americas. Warriors, weavers, and world builders. Deep sadness. Here's where the history gets frustratingly incomplete, because colonization destroyed so much of the written and oral record. Thoughtful. What we do know suggests indigenous women across the Americas held roles that would surprise a lot of people. Discovery. Among the Iroquois Confederacy, clan mothers held real political power. They could nominate and remove chiefs. Spiritual. In the Aztec world, women controlled market trade in cities like Tenochtitlan, and midwives held such respected status that they were considered spiritual authorities, not just medical ones. What it all actually means. Calm. Okay, we've gone from Egypt to Sparta to Tang China. Let's take a breath and think about what this actually means. Thinking. First, women were never passive background characters. Inspirational. Across every civilization, they ran economies, shaped politics, and produced culture. Sadness often, while being legally erased from the record. Doubt second, the biggest obstacle was never ability. It was documentation. Serious. The men who wrote history mostly wrote about other men, and where women appear, it's often through law, myth, or male opinion, rather than their own words. Thoughtful. Third, power took different shapes depending on the society. Sometimes it was formal and legal. Sometimes it was economic and quiet. Gravity, but it was almost never absent. Fast-paced. We have entire museums dedicated to ancient warfare. We reconstruct battle formations down to the smallest detail. Deep sadness. But the daily reality of half the population, running markets, brewing beer, writing the first poetry in human history, ruling empires from behind a curtain, and sometimes from the throne itself. Whisper barely shows up in mainstream history. Quiet. It's not in the documentaries. It's barely in the textbooks. And yet this is one of the most consequential, most overlooked stories in the history of every single civilization that has ever existed.